Silence is the last luxury of a woman who has already seen the bill. At 8:17 p.m., snow moved gently over Fifth Avenue, softening the black cars lined along East 82nd Street and turning the museum steps into a pale, glittering stage. The Alden Museum of Modern Legacy rose 12 stories above the sidewalk, all smoked glass, black marble, and warm brass lighting, with the city glowing behind it like a promise no one intended to keep. From the top-floor donor lounge, Manhattan looked almost tender, its towers lit in gold and silver, while Serena Whitlock stood beneath a chandelier imported from Baccarat and felt the cold distance inside her marriage more clearly than the winter beyond the windows. She did not shiver. For 3 years, Serena had built this night in rooms most cameras would never enter, across walnut tables at the Carlyle, private lunches near Madison Avenue, and quiet calls with collectors who measured trust more carefully than money. She had negotiated $1.2 billion in pledged gifts, secured 11 private art loans, and designed a donor protection structure so discreet that even Pierce Alden's closest advisors only understood the surface. Her burgundy satin gown caught the amber light as she moved through the crowd, elegant, calm, and almost invisible to the people applauding the wrong man. Pierce smiled for them. He stood near the main staircase in a Tom Ford tuxedo, one hand resting lightly on a glass of sparkling water, his silver watch angled just enough to catch the photographer's flashes. Every detail on him looked prepared: the folded pocket square, the measured grin, the practiced humility of a man who had spent more time rehearsing gratitude than feeling it. To the press, he was the billionaire patron who had given the city a temple of culture. To Serena, he was a man who had slowly learned to mistake her labor for his aura. The cameras loved him. Liora Voss arrived 9 minutes after the first trustee's speech, late enough to be noticed and early enough to be forgiven. Her champagne silk dress moved like poured cream under the museum lights, and her pale smile widened each time a photographer lifted a lens. She touched Pierce's sleeve with the ease of someone who had been told the room already belonged to her, though she could not have named the first acquisition in the West Gallery or explained why the Flemish collection required restricted humidity at 42%. Serena watched her from 30 feet away. No one asked Serena to stand beside Pierce for the opening portrait. No one asked her to explain how the Meyer family endowment had been saved after 6 months of private doubt. No one mentioned the 12-page stewardship memo she had written by hand at 2:06 a.m. During the week, the museum nearly lost its cornerstone donor. They only saw the finished building, the polished stone, the flute glasses, and the man standing in front of it. That was the trick. Outside, the snow thickened against the glass, turning the city lights into blurred halos over Park Avenue, while inside, waiters moved between donors with silver trays and silent shoes. The air smelled of white lilies, beeswax polish, cold champagne, and the faint metallic scent of new construction hidden beneath luxury perfume. Serena rested one hand on the black leather donor folder she had carried from her office, its corners worn from 3 years of meetings, revisions, and promises made in rooms where Pierce had never earned a seat. Then the lights dimmed. A museum director stepped to the microphone and welcomed the guests to what he called a legacy built by vision. Pierce looked toward Serena for half a second, not with love, but with the satisfied glance of a man checking whether his finest accessory was still in place. She understood it then, before the curtain moved, before the applause began, before the wall revealed what he had done. Her marriage had not ended with a shout. It had ended in perfect lighting. The curtain rose at 8:43 p.m. And the black marble tribute wall caught the chandelier light like a blade polished for ceremony. Gold letters shimmered across the surface, listing founding patrons, cultural trustees, and private benefactors who had paid for silence as much as prestige. At the center, where Serena Whitlock's name had been approved in 3 separate donor memorandums, a new inscription gleamed beneath the museum's seal: Liora Voss, visionary partner. The room applauded. Pierce Alden stood beneath the warm lights with a smile wide enough for the cameras, his hand resting possessively at Leora's back, while 28 feet away, half hidden beside a shadowed archway, Serena remained still with her black donor folder pressed against her ribs. His laughter blended with crystal glasses and soft classical strings, but her silence had a cleaner sound, like snow settling on a locked door. Liora lifted one hand to her chest as if overcome by honor, her champagne silk dress glowing beneath the gallery lights, and the photographers rewarded her with a storm of white flashes. Serena's face did not change. The split between them was almost architectural. Pierce in the center of the room, smiling under $400,000 worth of lighting design, and Serena near the darkened corridor, watching the empire reveal exactly where it thought she belonged. He had mistaken absence for obedience. A trustee from Boston leaned toward Serena and whispered that there must have been a last-minute printing error. A donor's wife from Palm Beach lowered her champagne flute without drinking, her eyes moving from Serena's blank space on the wall to Liora's shining name. Malcolm Dreyer stood near the east column, pale under the museum lights, because he knew no printer had made that decision by accident. Serena closed the folder. Pierce finally crossed the room with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed humiliation could be managed if it was wrapped in enough velvet. He smelled faintly of cedar cologne and winter air, and his cufflinks flashed as he adjusted his sleeve before speaking. "It's optics, Serena," he said quietly, still smiling for the crowd over her shoulder. She looked at him once. He continued, telling her the board wanted a younger public face for the museum, someone softer, brighter, more accessible to the press. He said her real value was private, strategic, foundational, as though being erased from a wall she built was a compliment if delivered in the correct tone. Behind him, Liora laughed at something a photographer said, touching the new inscription with two manicured fingers as if she had earned the stone beneath them. Serena heard everything. Malcolm stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Serena could hear him. "If they removed you without donor notice, the Donor Reliance Covenant is triggered, and the Patron Confidentiality Mandate gives every principal benefactor withdrawal review within 72 hours. He did not sound dramatic. He sounded like a man reading the weather before a bridge collapsed. Serena's thumb moved across the folder clasp. Pierce's smile thinned when he saw Malcolm beside her. He said Serena was overreacting, that names could be corrected later, that tonight belonged to the museum and not to personal feelings. In the ceiling-high windows behind him, Manhattan glittered through falling snow, bright and indifferent, while the room stayed warm enough to make betrayal feel civilized. Serena opened the folder and removed the cream envelope already addressed to Harrington Vale LLP, Private Stewardship Division, 610 Madison Avenue. Inside lay the black-silver fountain pen Pierce had given her 3 years earlier, the night the first $250 million endowment had been secured. She placed it on the marble cocktail table, uncapped it, and signed one sentence across the instruction page: "Proceed under my maiden authority." The nib broke with a small, dry crack against the paper. Pierce glanced down at the damaged pen, then back at her, finally irritated because she had ruined something expensive in a way no camera could understand. Malcolm looked at the signature and whispered the terms as if naming a verdict: Endowment Freeze Protocol, Founder Origin IP Registry, Beneficial Stewardship Authority, Legacy Naming Reversion Clause. Each phrase landed softer than applause and heavier than stone. Serena slid the signed page into the envelope, sealed it with one clean press of her palm, and gave it to Malcolm without ceremony. The only sound was the flat kiss of wax against paper. Pierce's expression shifted for less than a second, too quick for most people to catch, but Serena saw it clearly. For the first time that night, the man under the lights realized the woman in the shadow had not come empty-handed. Liora continued smiling at the wall, unaware that the name beside her hand had just become the most expensive mistake in the building. Serena stepped past Pierce toward the private corridor, leaving him surrounded by applause, flashbulbs, and a tribute wall that suddenly looked less like a legacy than a receipt. Serena entered the private corridor at 8:51 p.m., where the museum changed from spectacle to machinery. Behind her, Pierce Alden remained beneath the chandelier glow, laughing for a circle of donors as if the night were still moving according to his script. Ahead of her, the service hallway narrowed into polished concrete, steel security doors, and motion lights that switched on one by one, revealing the part of the museum no press release had ever praised. She kept walking. On the public side of the wall, Pierce raised a glass beside Liora Voss, his smile framed by gold lettering and camera flashes, while in the darker spine of the building, Serena moved alone past humidity monitors, sealed crates, and temperature logs reading 68 degrees with 42% relative moisture. Snow pressed against the high windows at the far end of the corridor, blurring the Manhattan lights into pale streaks above East 82nd Street. Her heels made a controlled sound on the floor, not hurried, not hesitant, just final. The first security panel accepted her palm at 8:53 p.m. A soft green line moved across the scanner, and the lock released with a discreet metallic click. Serena stepped into the Founder's Archive, a windowless room 42 feet below the main gallery, where donor files, acquisition histories, and restricted stewardship materials were stored in matte black cabinets under museum-grade climate control. The air smelled of cold metal and dry paper. A wall phone rang once. She ignored it. On the main floor, Pierce was still performing ease, telling a Los Angeles collector that Liora represented a fresh cultural chapter, while Serena opened Cabinet 7 with the access phrase tied to her maiden authority. Inside rested the encrypted founder duplicate labeled W Origin Ledger, the donor correspondence index, and the private governance map Pierce had once called too technical for the board dinner. Her hand closed around the certified cold storage copy registered under her maiden governance authority. The case felt colder than the room itself. Malcolm Dreyer's message arrived on her phone at 8:56 p.m., brief and precise. Harrington Vale received the sealed instruction. Private Stewardship Division confirms preliminary review under Donor Reliance Covenant and Endowment Freeze Protocol. Serena read it once, then placed the phone face down on the archive table. There was no triumph in her expression, only the calm of a woman who had stopped asking a careless man to understand what he had been standing on. She removed a second document from the folder. It was the Founder's Access Reassignment Notice, drafted 18 months earlier by her attorney after Pierce had joked, over lunch at the Mark, that museums were easier to control when only one name mattered. Serena had smiled that day. She signed the notice now. The pen left a dark, clean line across the page. The only sound was the sharp tear of the perforated legal seal as she separated her copy from his. Upstairs, applause rose again, softened by distance, as Pierce continued smiling under the lights and Liora posed beside a name that had no foundation beneath it. Downstairs, Serena slid the certified cold storage copy into a black leather case, removed her founding access card from its lanyard, and placed it on the steel table. She pressed the deactivation tab with her thumb. The card split through the center with a crisp plastic crack. At 9:02 p.m., Pierce finally appeared at the archive doorway, breath slightly uneven, tuxedo perfect, but eyes less certain. He looked first at the broken card, then at the black leather case in Serena's hand, then at the signed notice resting under the white archive lamp. "You are making this personal," he said. Serena looked past him toward the distant glow of the main hall, where his laughter had only minutes earlier filled the room without her name in it. "No," she said softly. "You made it public." He stepped inside, lowering his voice, warning her that donors hated instability and that she was risking everything they had built. Serena closed the leather case with a quiet snap and picked up the sealed duplicate addressed to Harrington Vale LLP, 610 Madison Avenue. "The patron confidentiality mandate protects them from instability," she said. "The beneficial stewardship authority protects them from you." Pierce had no answer. For once, the hallway behind him looked brighter than he did. Serena walked past him with the certified duplicate in one hand and the envelope in the other, leaving the archive colder, cleaner, and stripped of the illusion that Pierce controlled what he had never built. At the elevator, she turned just long enough to give him the sentence he would remember longer than the wall. "You thought the name on the wall was the legacy, but the donors were the foundation." The doors closed between them at 9:05 p.m., and the last thing Pierce heard was the low mechanical hum of the elevator carrying his foundation away. At 7:14 a.m., the morning after the opening, snow still clung to the ledges of the Alden Museum, and the city lights faded behind a gray Manhattan sky that made the black marble facade look less like a monument and more like a warning. Pierce Alden stood in the top-floor executive suite with his tuxedo jacket replaced by a navy Brioni suit, laughing too loudly on a donor call while 3 unread alerts glowed on the conference screen behind him. Across town, in a private office on Madison Avenue, Serena Whitlock sat in a shadowed corner beneath a brass lamp, silent, composed, and wrapped in the kind of calm that did not ask permission. The first freeze notice arrived at 7:22. Harrington Vale LLP occupied the 36th floor of a limestone tower at 610 Madison Avenue, where the windows looked down on yellow cabs pushing through slush, and the air smelled faintly of coffee, wool coats, and old paper. Serena's attorney, Lenore Pike, placed 5 cream-colored folders on the table, each one marked with a different donor family name, each one carrying more weight than Pierce's entire speech from the night before. Serena did not touch them at first. She listened. Lenore adjusted her reading glasses and said, "The Meyer Endowment has invoked the endowment freeze protocol for $250 million, pending stewardship review." She turned the next page. "The Bellamy Collection has paused long-term art placement under curatorial integrity charter. The Ashbourne Family Office has requested withdrawal analysis through the patron confidentiality mandate." Outside the glass, snow slid down the window in thin white lines, while inside the room, every sentence landed with the quiet force of a vault door closing. Serena folded her hands. On the museum's top floor, Pierce smiled under recessed lighting and told a San Francisco patron that last night's inscription issue had been a minor internal matter, while Serena watched Lenore open the black leather case containing the certified W.Origin Ledger archive copy. His voice, piped through a speaker on Malcolm Dreyer's forwarded recording, sounded polished, confident, hollow. Her silence made it sound worse. Lenore connected the certified archive copy to an isolated legal terminal at 7:39 a.m. The screen filled with negotiation logs, donor reliance notes, stewardship maps, private acquisition protections, and the original architecture of the museum's funding model under Serena's maiden authority. The room went still. Even Malcolm, seated at the far end of the table with his coat still dusted in melting snow, lowered his eyes as if looking at a foundation stone someone had mistaken for decoration. Lenore said, "This confirms founder origin IP registry ownership." Serena nodded once. Pierce's office looked bright on the emergency board call at 8:03 a.m., full of glass, chrome, and men pretending the floor was not tilting beneath them. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting near a Mont Blanc pen, and smiled when a trustee asked whether Serena had legal standing to interfere with donor operations. In the bottom corner of the screen, Malcolm's face remained unreadable. Then Lenore joined the call. She did not raise her voice. "Ms. Whitlock is not interfering," she said. "She is reclaiming restricted stewardship architecture, donor intelligence protocols, and beneficial oversight authority created under her maiden governance file." Pierce's smile stayed in place for half a second too long. Liora Voss sat beside him in an ivory silk blouse, blinking as if the language itself were an insult she had not prepared for. A trustee asked what that meant in practical terms. Lenore answered, "It means the museum may retain the building, but not the trust mechanism that funded it." The only sound was the clean click of Serena's attorney stamping the first reversion notice in black ink. At 8:11 a.m., the conference room at Harrington Vale smelled of warm toner and sealed envelopes. Serena signed the Founder Origin IP Enforcement Directive with the same hand that had once written donor seating charts at 2:06 a.m. The pen did not break this time. It moved smoothly, almost gently, across the paper, as if consequence had finally found its proper form. On the screen, Pierce stopped laughing. Liora whispered something to him, but he did not look at her. He was staring at Serena now, not as a wife, not as an accessory, not as the woman he had pushed into the dark beside his shining wall, but as the architect who had just removed the load-bearing beam from his empire. Serena closed the folder and slid it toward Lenore. "Proceed," she said. Outside, the last night lights of Manhattan disappeared into morning snow, and inside, the first $1 billion entered formal freeze review without making a sound. By 10:26 a.m., the snow had turned heavier over Madison Avenue, pressing white against the tall windows of Harrington Vale LLP, while the city below moved in slow silver lines of cabs, black sedans, and umbrellas bending in the wind. Pierce Alden remained on the museum's executive floor under bright recessed lights, smiling through a second emergency call and telling trustees that donor concern was temporary optics. In the darker legal conference room 36 floors above the street, Serena Whitlock sat without a coat, without jewelry except pearl earrings, watching Lenore Pike place a new set of documents beside the certified WAT Origin Ledger Archive copy. The trust was no longer theoretical. 3 years earlier, before Pierce had begun calling her too private for public leadership, Serena had registered her maiden name for a foundation she hoped would one day open doors for women who had been priced out of culture. Not as a vanity project, not as a social ornament, but as a serious vehicle for scholarships, artist residencies, acquisition literacy, and legal protection for small community archives. She had called it Whitlock Arts Trust because Whitlock was the name she had before anyone mistook her silence for dependence. Lenore slid the charter across the table. At 10:41 a.m., the first donor review letter arrived from the Meyer Endowment, placing $250 million under suspended museum stewardship while opening formal transfer eligibility review for Whitlock Arts Trust under the Beneficial Stewardship Authority. At 10:48, the Ashbourne office followed with a restricted pledge conversion tied to women-led arts education. At 10:55, the Bellamy Collection authorized Serena to redirect advisory custody of 9 works, each insured above $18 million, away from Alden Museum programming until curatorial integrity could be restored. Serena read every line slowly. On one screen, Pierce laughed beside Liora in the glass-walled boardroom, his smile sharpened by panic but still aimed at the cameras he had allowed inside for a resilient statement. On the table before Serena, a foundation seal weighted in matte black brass, quiet as a judge. Liora sat near Pierce in a cream silk dress, nodding whenever he spoke, though her eyes kept moving toward the financial dashboard behind him. Red markers appeared beside endowment liquidity, donor retention, and exhibition reserve coverage. She touched Pierce's wrist when a photographer entered the room, but pulled her hand away when the chief financial officer whispered that restricted funds could not be replaced with public donations. The room was starting to understand that prestige could not cover restricted funds. Lenore pointed to the central clause of the Whitlock Arts Trust instrument. The donor continuity election allows principal benefactors to follow the originating steward, provided the prior institution violated the legacy naming reversion clause or materially altered the founding representation. Malcolm Dreyer exhaled once, quietly. They did both. Serena picked up the black brass seal. The document beneath her hand bore the full name she had not used in public for years: Serena Whitlock, founder and executive steward. Outside, a gust of snow erased the view of Park Avenue for 3 seconds, turning the glass into a pale wall. Inside, the lamp cast a small circle of gold over the signature line. The seal came down with a firm, final weight. The only sound was the deep press of brass biting into paper. At the museum, Pierce's public smile finally cracked when the first preliminary donor withdrawal review summary reached the boardroom printer. A page slid out, then another, each one warm, white, and devastatingly polite. Liora tried to read over his shoulder, but the words were not made for performance. They were made for consequence. Endowment freeze protocol. Patron confidentiality mandate. Donor continuity election. Founder origin IP registry. Pierce looked at the camera crew, then at the tribute wall visible through the glass beyond the boardroom, where Liora's name still glittered under perfect lighting. It looked expensive. It no longer looked powerful. Serena closed the Whitlock Arts Trust folder at 11:07 a.m. and stood. Her first program was structured to fund 12 women from working-class families for archive preservation grants, and 1 legal defense fund for artists whose work had been taken without recognition. Lenore asked if she wanted to issue a public statement. Serena looked toward the storm-softened skyline, where the city lights from the higher towers still burned faintly through the morning snow. "No," she said. "Open the doors." At 2:18 p.m., the Alden Museum no longer sounded like an opening day triumph. It sounded like a building learning the price of losing trust. Snow dragged across the high windows in thick white sheets, dimming the city lights that usually glittered above Fifth Avenue even in daylight. On the executive floor, Pierce Alden stood beneath a row of warm recessed lamps, laughing for a nervous arts correspondent while 3 trustees watched the liquidity dashboard fall in silence. The room did not laugh with him. In the West Gallery, Liora Voss stood beside a bronze sculpture in her cream silk dress, practicing phrases like cultural renewal and emotional access for an interview scheduled at 2:30. Across town, Serena Whitlock sat in a quieter office at Whitlock Arts Trust, reviewing scholarship files from women in Detroit, Baltimore, Queens, and rural Georgia. On one screen, Pierce performed confidence under museum lights. On Serena's desk, 12 applicant folders waited in the shadow of a brass lamp. One future was posing for cameras, the other was opening a door. The museum's first crisis came from insurance. At 2:27 p.m., a London underwriter suspended coverage review on 6 loaned works after the Bellamy collection questioned whether Alden still met the curatorial integrity charter. At 2:34, the transportation insurer for a planned Basel exchange requested updated stewardship authority, and the finance office could not produce it. At 2:41, a senior trustee asked why a $78 million exhibition reserve had been marked restricted, donor-dependent, non-transferable, without originating steward approval. Pierce loosened his tie. Malcolm Dreyer entered the boardroom with a blue folder, his expression flat from lack of sleep and too much truth. Pierce smiled at him as if authority could be recovered through charm. "Tell them this is procedural," Pierce said, glancing toward the reporter through the glass. Malcolm opened the folder. "It is not procedural," he replied. The words changed the air. Lenore Pike's legal notice had arrived by courier at 2:44, printed on heavy cream paper and addressed to the Board of Trustees, Stewardship Compliance Office. It cited the Founder Origin IP Registry, the donor continuity election, the patron confidentiality mandate, and a temporary enforcement hold on the museum's donor intelligence platform. The chief financial officer read the first page twice, then stopped pretending the problem was public relations. The only sound was the slow rip of the courier's seal as Malcolm opened the final notice. Leora's interview began 3 minutes late. She smiled beneath a halo of gallery light while Pierce watched from the boardroom, still trying to look amused beside the glass wall. The interviewer asked how she planned to rebuild patron confidence after several principal benefactors initiated withdrawal review. Liora blinked, touched the side of her champagne-toned sleeve, and said art was about feeling seen. No one wrote that down. At Whitlock Arts Trust, Serena signed the first conditional education grant approval at 3:06 p.m., authorizing $1.8 million for a women-led archive preservation program in Chicago pending final trustee clearance. Snow blurred the skyline behind her, but the city lights were beginning to glow again in the higher towers, faint and patient through the storm. She did not watch Leora's interview live. She did not need to. By 3:19, the museum's internal chat had filled with quiet panic because the clip of Liora failing to explain donor withdrawal rights had already reached 2 trustee phones and 1 private collector group in Palm Beach. Pierce tried to laugh it off in front of the reporter, but his mouth moved too quickly and his eyes kept returning to the numbers on the wall screen. The endowment liquidity line had dropped below the emergency threshold. His empire was not collapsing loudly. It was being reclassified, restricted, suspended, and reviewed. At 3:32, the museum printer released the revised cash position report, and the first page slid onto the tray with a soft mechanical sigh. Pierce picked it up before anyone else could. The headline was only 6 words: Immediate Stewardship Deficit, Donor Confidence Event. For the first time since the wall had been unveiled, he did not look toward Leora's name. He looked toward the empty place where Serena's should have been. By 5:46 p.m., the snow had turned the museum windows into pale mirrors, and the city lights outside Fifth Avenue looked distant, almost underwater. Pierce Alden stood in the main gallery under warm architectural lamps, laughing for 2 remaining cameras, as if confidence could be performed loudly enough to replace a missing $1 billion. In the darker trustee corridor beyond the glass wall, Malcolm Dreyer spoke quietly with 3 board members while a red liquidity warning pulsed on a tablet no one wanted photographed. The building had split in 2. Liora Voss still wore her cream silk dress, but the fabric no longer looked effortless beneath the gallery lights. It looked thin, expensive, and poorly suited for a room filled with questions. She stood beside the black marble tribute wall, one hand near her own shining name, while Pierce told a Chicago trustee that the donor freeze was temporary market hesitation. At the same hour, across Madison Avenue, Serena Whitlock sat in the softly lit office of Whitlock Arts Trust, reading the first applicant letter from a young sculptor in Queens whose mother cleaned hotel rooms for 22 years. Serena smiled once. The museum's board meeting began at 6:03 p.m. inside a glass conference room overlooking the snowy rooftops and the blurred red lights of traffic below. Pierce took the head chair because he still believed chairs created authority. Liora sat to his right, arranged like a public statement in ivory, while Malcolm placed Lenore Pike's newest notice in the center of the table with both hands. No one touched it. The first trustee, a retired judge from Connecticut, asked Liora to explain the museum's revised patron confidence strategy for the next fiscal quarter. Liora leaned forward, smiled softly, and said the museum needed to invite emotion back into the conversation. The judge looked at Pierce. Pierce laughed lightly, the practiced sound of a man begging the room not to notice the floor beneath him cracking. Malcolm opened the notice and read, Harrington Vale confirms an expanded stewardship default review under the Donor Reliance Covenant, with immediate suspension of discretionary programming tied to the former donor intelligence architecture. The words were clean, formal, and devastating. A trustee asked whether Alden could rebuild the system internally. Malcolm answered, not without violating the Founder Origin IP Registry and the Beneficial Stewardship Authority. Pierce stopped laughing. Outside the glass, snow slid down the windows in white veins while Manhattan's towers burned with cold evening light. Inside the conference room, Liora finally revealed what she truly wanted. She did not ask about the students affected by the suspended education wing. She did not ask about the artists whose residencies were now frozen. She asked whether her title, her housing allowance, and her advisory fee were still protected under the revised budget. The room went silent. Pierce turned toward her slowly. Liora touched the edge of the table with polished nails and said she had been promised a visible position, a press profile, and compensation appropriate to cultural leadership. Malcolm's face did not move. The trustee from Connecticut removed his glasses. On the wall screen, the revised budget opened line by line, showing suspended donor funds, legal reserves, insurance holds, and a proposed elimination of non-essential ceremonial roles. Liora's title sat under ceremonial roles. The only sound was the brittle scrape of her nail against the glass table as she read the line that erased her budget. Pierce whispered her name, not with affection, but with warning. She looked at him then, and the softness disappeared from her face. She said she had not dressed, smiled, and stood beside that wall to be blamed for the legal problem Pierce had created. The sentence landed harder than she intended. 3 trustees looked up at once. Malcolm closed the blue folder. Across town, Serena signed the final conditional approval for the Whitlock Arts Trust Emergency Archive Fund at 6:31 p.m., authorizing $4.6 million for 5 women-led institutions before the end of the fiscal week. Her office smelled of black coffee, warm paper, and snow-damp wool from the coats hanging near the door. On her desk, no tribute wall stood, no cameras waited, and no one pretended a name could replace competence. Lenore called from the legal conference line and said, the board has entered formal stewardship default review. Alden can keep the marble. He cannot keep the mechanism. Serena looked out at the city lights glowing through the storm. Good, she said. Back at the museum, Pierce sat beneath perfect lighting while the glass table reflected his face, Liora's fading title, and the empty chair where Serena had never been invited to sit. For the first time, the room saw the truth clearly. He had not chosen a new visionary. He had chosen a vacancy in silk. For years later, at 9:12 p.m., snow fell over Geneva in fine silver lines, and the city lights along Lake Geneva shimmered beyond the glass walls of the International Auction House, like jewelry resting underwater. Pierce Alden stood beneath the white auction lamps in a charcoal tuxedo, laughing softly with a Zurich banker who no longer asked him about museum expansion. Across the room, near a darker alcove lined with velvet panels and private bidding screens, Serena Whitlock stood in a deep red evening suit, silent, composed, and surrounded by people who spoke to her with the careful respect once reserved for old families and ancient money. No one needed an inscription to know where the power had moved. The auction was for the Calder Mercer collection, 14 works valued at $380 million, including a rare modernist triptych that Serena intended to place inside a public education program for women from underfunded art schools. Whitlock Arts Trust had grown from a legal response into a national institution with 72 scholarships, 9 community archive partnerships, and a $1.6 billion protected endowment governed under Serena's stewardship equity framework. No tribute wall announced her greatness. The results did. Pierce tried to smile when a former Alden donor crossed the room and greeted Serena first. He lifted his glass as if it did not matter. But in the polished black reflection of the auction floor, his posture looked smaller than it had 4 winters earlier, and Liora Voss was nowhere near him now. At 9:26, Serena's counsel, Lenore Pike, joined her near the private bidding desk with a slim folder stamped Whitlock Arts Trust, Acquisition Governance Unit. The board has cleared the Cultural Access Preservation Authority, Lenore said quietly. The bid can proceed under the beneficiary education mandate, and the donor pool has waived publicity rights through the patron anonymity shield. Serena nodded. On the far side of the room, Pierce leaned toward the Zurich banker and laughed again, but the sound broke apart beneath the auctioneer's voice. In the light, he performed relevance. In the shadow, Serena prepared consequence. The bidding opened at $210 million. A London representative raised a paddle. A private foundation from Boston entered at $225 million. Serena did not move until the room reached $290 million, then lifted her numbered card with the same calm hand that had once sealed Pierce's downfall on Madison Avenue. The auctioneer looked toward her immediately. Everyone did. Pierce's smile faded 1 careful inch. At $340 million, the Boston bidder withdrew after a whispered call. At $352 million, the London representative hesitated, then folded his paddle against the catalog. Lenore leaned closer and said, "If we win, the acquisition falls permanently under the public benefit custody provision. No resale, no vanity naming, no private leverage." Serena looked at the triptych glowing under museum-grade light. "That is the point," she said. The final bid was $360 million. The auctioneer brought down the hammer at 9:41 p.m. The only sound was the clean strike of polished wood against the block, and in that small echo, an entire room understood that Serena had not bought status. She had purchased access for people who had been kept outside it. Applause rose, measured and genuine. Pierce stood beneath the bright lamps with his hands together, smiling because not clapping would reveal too much. Across the room, Serena remained near the velvet shadow, accepting congratulations without hunger, without performance, without needing anyone to rewrite her name in stone. A former Alden trustee approached Pierce and said, almost kindly, that Whitlock Arts Trust had become what Alden Museum had promised to be. Pierce looked toward Serena, then toward the catalog in his hand, where her foundation's name appeared beside the winning acquisition. His thumb pressed too hard against the page. The paper creased sharply down the center. At 9:48, Lenore placed the acquisition deed before Serena on a small ebony table. Snow moved beyond the windows, softening the lights of Geneva, while the signatures on the page fixed the collection into protected educational custody for the next 100 years. Serena signed her name slowly. Serena Whitlock, founder and executive steward. The ink dried under the lamp. Pierce watched from the other side of the room, finally understanding that she had not returned to be accepted. She had become the room others entered carefully. At 10:06 p.m., after the auction house emptied into the silver hush of Geneva's snow, Serena Whitlock stood beside a glass corridor overlooking Lake Geneva, the city lights stretching across the water like a quiet signature. Behind her, Whitlock Arts Trust staff secured the acquisition deed, the patron anonymity shield, and the public benefit custody provision that would keep the $360 million collection in educational access for the next 100 years. Across the corridor, Pierce Alden waited beneath a softer pool of light. Older now, less polished, his tuxedo still expensive, but his confidence worn thin at the edges. For 4 years, he had told himself Serena had taken the donors because she was wounded, because she wanted punishment, because she wanted him to feel the public absence he had once forced on her. But tonight made the truth impossible to avoid. He had placed his mistress's name on Serena's museum wall, and the billion-dollar donors had followed the woman who had protected them from the beginning. Pierce approached slowly, holding the auction catalog folded in one hand, the crease still sharp where her foundation's name had been printed beside the winning bid. Snow tapped lightly against the glass. The hallway smelled of cold air, polished wood, and fading lilies from the reception below. He said her name with none of the command he once used in New York. Serena turned toward him, calm in her deep red evening suit, pearl earrings catching the light, her face composed not by pride but by peace. Pierce looked past her to the room where donors were still speaking with Lenore Pike, Malcolm Dreyer, and the new trustees of Whitlock Arts Trust. "They followed you," he said, almost to himself. Serena did not correct him immediately. She let him hear the sentence he had spent years avoiding. The museum had not failed because of one wall, one mistress, one photograph, or one speech. It had failed because Pierce had mistaken visibility for value, and in doing so, he removed the only person who had made the value real. He looked down at the catalog. "I thought your name on that wall was ceremonial," he admitted. "I thought the donors cared about the building, the press, the Alden name." Serena's gaze remained steady. "They cared about stewardship." His mouth tightened. He asked if she had hated him all these years. Outside, a fairy light crossed the dark water, small and patient, while snow blurred the skyline into soft white distance. Serena thought of the black marble wall in Manhattan, the champagne silk dress, the broken access card, the sealed envelope, the first scholarship folder, the young women who had entered classrooms because a door had finally opened. She did not feel hatred. Hatred would have kept her standing in the same room forever. "No," she said. "I healed." Pierce closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the performance was gone. He apologized for erasing her name, for using Liora as a symbol, for treating her mind like private labor and her presence like decoration. He said he had spent years in rooms that grew quieter after she left, trying to rebuild donor confidence with consultants, press campaigns, new boards, and expensive language. Nothing worked. The people who funded Legacy had already chosen the person who protected it. Serena listened without interrupting. Forgiveness came to her not like a grand gesture, but like setting down a heavy glass without breaking it. She could release the pain without returning to the person who caused it. Pierce stepped closer, careful now, almost humble. "Is there any version of us," he asked, "after all this?" Serena looked at him with the gentle finality of a woman who no longer needed the answer to hurt. She thought of the phrase she had lived by since that snowy night on Fifth Avenue. Revenge is loud, consequences quiet. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had not exposed private wounds for public entertainment. She had simply left with the people, the trust, and the billion-dollar foundation he had never understood. Behind her, Lenore closed the acquisition folder, and the brass clasp met with a small, decisive click. The sound was not cruel. It was complete. Serena gave Pierce her forgiveness, but not her future. Then she turned toward the room where her donors, artists, lawyers, and scholarship recipients were waiting, no longer a woman erased from a wall, but the foundation others now built upon. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. Pierce remained alone in the corridor, finally understanding that a name carved in marble can be replaced, but trust, once it walks out the door, does not come back on command. Serena paused at the doorway, looked back once, and said, "I choose myself."